So today I'm replacing the output shaft seal on the axle. This. Alright. Everything's got to come off. First thing we're going to do before we get it on jacks, since the hub has to come off, you have to take the spindle nut off. You have to crack it loose because it's torqued on really tight. So before it's on jacks, we'll crack that loose while it's still on the ground. This nut is crimped on. See that? So before we can loosen it, we have to uncrimp it. So it's a 30 millimeter. So we got a big 30 millimeter socket, breaker bar, and a long pipe. Of course, always have your e-brake on when you're doing this. You don't just want to be yanking on it with just the transmission hold. There it is. Alright. Okay. The wheel's off, we can see what's going on. So, that axle seal is way back here, behind this, back there. Can't even see it yet. So, caliper's got to come off, the hub's got to get out of the way, the tie rod's got to come off. And then we'll have to pull the CV joint out and the whole axle. So let's get started. The brake caliper off. There's just two bolts, one on top and one on the bottom. 12 millimeter. Okay, there's the caliper. You don't want to let this hang from the brake line, so we're just gonna hang it up here off the coil spring, up out of the way. Now we're going to loosen these two bolts that actually hold the hub on. See, this is the strut tower, shocks, so that holds this hub on. And then, so we'll loosen these, and then we'll take the tie rod nut off. And on the tie rod, there's a cotter pin. So we'll have to take this cotter pin out and then loosen the nut. Those are loose. I'm tie rod disconnected. Okay, you can reuse that, but I got a whole set of cotter pins, so we'll put a new one in when we reinstall this. And it looks like that's a 17 millimeter. Yes, that cracked loose pretty easily. I mean, you don't want these tie rod nuts too tight. That's what the cotter pin's for. Okay. Oof. Alright, that's all we gotta do with that. That can just hang right there. Get this nut off. Now we'll get these two bolts out of the way. Okay. Nut and a lock washer. That's what that looks like. Okay, so slide this hub out of the way, and the only thing it's attached to right now is the ball joint, the control arm down here. There's only one bolt, but we're gonna try to leave it attached. We'll take it off if we have to, but we'll see if we can leave it. See the axle just slides out of there. Okay. And there is the CV joint, the outer CV joint. So now we got to get in there with the crowbar and pull this axle out. Okay, so let's just get a closer view of what's going on here. So this is the hub, but I've heard it called 3 different things. Some people call it the spindle, some people call it the steering knuckle. It's, you know, so, but it just attaches here to the ball joint. There's a ball joint in this. See the boot, the rubber protector, and this is the control arm that bolts to the frame. But this car doesn't have a frame necessarily because the body is the frame. It's a unibody car. See where this bolts up? Well, you can't see the bolts really, but there's one. And see this rest? This is how these cars die, because they'll rest out here, and they'll rest out so much that they're not safe, because that's what's holding the wheel on, and this whole thing will just rust and rust. So that needs to be taken care of, but not today. But if you look in here, you can see this outer wheel bearing. There's 2 wheel bearings in this hub. You can see the outer one here. So let's take a look at this tie rod. So there's just a ball joint inside this. That's this here. That's called a zerk. Focus on that. You can attach a grease gun to that and shoot grease in there to keep it greased up. Okay, so what they do nowadays, they don't put those on there. So you have to buy a whole new tie rod because you can't re-grease them. However, you can add a zerk yourself easily by just drilling a small hole, and they're threaded, and they thread in to the metal, and now you have basically a valve where you can attach your grease gun and shoot grease in. But so the tie rod goes back, and there's another joint here, and then that goes into the steering mechanism. All right, so we're gonna try to get this CV axle out of here. Oh, there it is. Okay, leaking transmission fluid. Of course, should have had a touch pan under that. Right, so this is the CV joint. Well, inner CV joint, outer CV joint, and the axle. Now, this whole assembly is called the CV half shaft. It's just the axle. But so this goes into the transmission, and this here, of course, goes into the hub. And then if, you know, got plenty of flex, that's how that works. If you look in this groove, there's a clip. Yeah. That's basically what holds the axle into the transmission. Okay, so now we can finally see the seal we're replacing. This is the side of the transmission here. And on the other side, the other axle goes in just the same. Okay, so the seal is out now. This gave me a lot of trouble because I wasn't using the right tool. I tried to just yank this out of there and ended up splitting this apart. See, this is supposed to be one piece, and I pulled this apart because I didn't have this. So I went out and bought the seal puller and came right out of there. Now, you look in there, you see that big beefy transmission bearing. See the bearing in there? So we're just going to clean up all the fluid and put this new seal in. So I just ended up screwing that piece of pipe to a short piece of 2x4 so I could put the pipe up against the axle seal and hammer on the 2x4 to hammer it in evenly. Alright, so the new seal is installed. That did not go in easy. Guess we'll try to get everything put back together. Alright, so before we put this axle back in, we'll just get some grease on the end. And that's going to hold the C-clip in there so it doesn't fall off. It's in there. Sometimes you gotta get a hammer and tap on the end, but it clicked in. Now we can slip the axle into the hub. And I'll tell you a little something about the tie rods. See how this is, it's almost like it's wider at the top, but just a little bit skinnier at the bottom. That's so when you put it in this hole, it'll grab it. This being a little bit wider, it'll grab the metal and hold on. When you tighten your nut, it'll hold the bolt and it won't spin in the joint, because remember, this is just a ball joint in here. There's just a ball attached to the end of that bolt and then grease. So you'll be tightening this and the bolts will be spinning. And what you do, you just got to push that down in there more so that it grabs. We got to line up this with the hole in the bolt to put our cotter pin in there. See? Yeah, I had to line that up. That's called a castle nut, by the way. And we'll just shut the dog up and grab a pair of pliers so we can get this. Well, just do it with your fingers, actually. We'll get a pair of pliers for the other side. Okay, let's get the brake caliper put back on. This little clip just goes on there to help the brake pads slide in and out easier. That's what those brake pads actually slide on once this is all put back together. that I was talking about. These. So when you press on the brakes, your pads compress, and these little pieces of metal just kind of make it easier for them to slide without any hitches. New spindle nut, washer, old washer. You don't really need a new one of these. Okay. Okay. Now we'll get the wheel on the car, get it off the jacks, and then we'll get this really tight. Before I crimp this spindle nut, we're gonna have to put more transmission fluid in, and I'm gonna drive this thing, make sure there's no issues, because I don't want to have to crimp this and then be taking it back off again if I got a problem and have to buy a whole new nut. So we're gonna put transmission fluid in it and take it for a short drive. But yeah, you're really supposed to crimp that thing. So the very last thing to do is crimp this spindle nut. See how the axle has an indentation? So we're just going to crimp that into there. Should be good enough.